However, a funny thing happened, which was that polite, genteel audience started going to the minstrel shows and enjoying them very much and emulating slaves on southern plantations by buying a banjo. And this started happening around 1850, and that trend grew during the 1850s and 1860s right through the Civil War. How can we understand this? You know, in my opinion, it's one of the most twisted things about American culture from the 19th century that has persisted in its influence well through the 20th century and into the 21st century. People, primarily in the North, who might have been very liberal, might even have been abolitionists, being fascinated with the life of slaves on southern plantations and wanting to learn about that by going to minstrel shows in theaters and auditorium and wanting to emulate that by ordering a banjo themselves. The first, well, let me say that through the 1830s into the 1840s, banjos were still primarily made by hand, one at a time, the body of which were made out of gourds. A gourd, ethnomusicologists call them spike fiddles. It would be like a body, a resonator body, like a gourd, with a rod right through it, extending beyond the bottom to be rested on the ground, often sharpened to be rested on the ground, and then strings coming from that spike over some kind of bridge and skin on a bisected calabash gourd or smaller gourd, tied to the neck, which was round, and then tuned by pushing or pulling those rings that were holding the strings up or down the neck. So let's say when Thomas Jefferson in his diary wrote that the slaves were playing the fiddle and banjo for a dance, that's the kind of banjo he was referring to in the 1770s. Banjos at that time were rapidly evolving, but they were evolving in the Caribbean. There are references to banjos in Jamaica and Haiti also in the 1770s, but the makers of them were hybridizing the instruments. They were applying not a round stick, but a flat fingerboard, like a guitar fingerboard, and tuning pegs, even if they were early on friction pegs, rather than those push and pull rings that tied the strings, and 3 or 4 or 5 strings rather than 2 or 3. And obviously the repertoire was rapidly evolving also. So by the time those banjos reached the United States, they were already a new form of instrument. They might have been called a banjo, but they were not like African imbanzas or other similar instruments from West Africa, particularly Angola, Cameroon, and what's now Nigeria. So it was an American instrument. I like to think of the banjo because it is a hybrid instrument. It's a blending of guitars and the African gourd instruments to make something new. And as soon as the minstrel show craze hit, then there were, in that very, very early years of the Industrial Revolution, there were manufacturers who set about mass producing banjos. And the first one, I believe, was a man named Boucher in Baltimore right around 1850. So that's a year after Oh Susanna was a huge publishing phenomenon coast to coast. If you think about it, a banjo lends itself to industrial manufacture. You know, what's required is this metal rim, metal brackets, metal tighteners, metal armrest, metal tailpiece. These are all made out of steel. So if you get this assembly and you fasten an animal hide to it, and by the way, the dressing out of hides was also becoming much more refined at the time, so you could get thinner and more even hides. So it's like a drum head that you crank down to create the tension. The early ones were fretless, but if you wanted to cut frets, that was also clearly the work of a sort of a combination of a woodworking shop and a metal machining shop. You had to have saws that could cut the grooves at precise distances all the way up and down the neck, and then lay in the fret wire and burnish it and round it off and sand it with grinders to make it smooth and even on the player's fingers. And then, of course, very soon the tuning gears were made out of metal. So really, a banjo maker had to worry about this laminated rim and the neck. And it was not long before the necks had a tension rod hidden in them. It was, I don't know if you can see on this one. Here above this rod at the heel, there's another rod which can be loosened or tightened. That connects to a metal rod that runs down the center of the neck all the way up here to the peg head. And so if you need to adjust the action on the strings, you can tighten or loosen the tension rod that's secretly hidden in the neck. But that's more, again, more of a machine shop type of invention than a woodworking shop. Now, in contrast, guitars made entirely of wood, not only the resonance of the wood is very important, and you need different woods for different parts, you know, the sides, the back, the sounding board on the top, all different woods, very closely and carefully sawn and glued together. The ribs inside, very delicately shaped. You need very precise little planes and chisels and gouges, lots and lots of sandpaper to make a guitar. And it takes a lot of skill, expertise, and know-how. Compared to a guitar, a banjo can be manufactured very quickly and cheaply. So you have the motivation, which is ideological, and then you have the mass production, which is technological. It all came together in the early 1850s.